The worn leather journal trembled in the evening breeze as pages fluttered against weathered hands. Golden sunlight streamed across endless pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, a scene of prosperity that hadn't existed just 5 years earlier. An elderly woman's voice carried across the valley, soft yet certain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind refuses to accept. Love can bloom in the most unexpected arrangements, transforming both giver and receiver in ways neither could have imagined. Through the settling dusk, a figure emerged from the ranch house. A woman in her late 20s moved with quiet confidence across the porch, her steps sure and purposeful. In her arms, she cradled a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets, protecting it from the cool Colorado air. Behind her, the warm glow of windows revealed a home filled with life and laughter, a stark contrast to the empty shell it had once been. She paused at the edge of the property, where a simple wooden marker stood among wildflowers that had been carefully tended. The woman knelt gracefully, placing a single white rose at the base of the memorial. For a moment, she remained there, her head bowed in quiet respect, as if sharing a silent conversation with someone who could no longer answer. The wind carried the distant sound of children's laughter from the house, mixing with the gentle lowing of cattle in nearby fields. This was prosperity earned through struggle, happiness built on the foundation of an arrangement that had begun with nothing more than mutual need in desperate circumstances. I once believed that love had to be spontaneous to be real. The elderly woman's voice continued, carried on the evening air, until I witnessed how two broken souls could heal each other through the simple act of showing up, day after day, until need became want, and want became something far more precious. As suddenly as the vision appeared, it faded like morning mist, leaving only questions about how such transformation could emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. Millbrook Valley stretched across the Colorado landscape like a patchwork quilt of gold and green, its rolling hills dotted with cattle and bordered by the majestic Rocky Mountain foothills. The valley had been ranching country for over a century, where families built legacies on the backs of stubborn determination and the endless cycle of seasons. Here, tradition ran deeper than the irrigation channels that carved through the fertile soil, and change came as slowly as the mountain streams that fed them. The autumn of 2024 found the valley caught between two worlds. Corporate agriculture crept closer each year, buying up struggling family operations and consolidating them into massive, efficient enterprises. Meanwhile, the old-timers clung to methods passed down through generations, even as profit margins grew thinner and bank notices more frequent. It was a place where a man's word still meant something, where neighbors helped neighbors during calving season, and where the local diner served as both restaurant and unofficial community center. Against this backdrop of tradition and transition, two very different stories were about to collide in ways neither party could have anticipated. One was a tale of inherited responsibility, weighing heavily on shoulders that had already carried too much loss. The other was a story of determination and dreams deferred, of a young woman fighting against circumstances that seemed designed to crush her spirit before it could fully take flight. Emma Chen had never imagined that her senior year at Colorado State University would begin with her standing in line at the local food bank, clutching a crumpled grocery list and praying that no one from campus would see her there. At 22, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from facing adversity head-on, though the toll of constantly juggling multiple responsibilities showed in the slight shadows under her dark eyes and the way she carried herself with careful efficiency, as if each movement had been calculated to conserve precious energy. Her thick black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes, while clean and well-maintained, bore the subtle signs of extended wear. She had learned to shop at thrift stores with the eye of someone who understood value, selecting pieces that could serve multiple purposes and withstand the demands of her schedule. Despite the financial pressures that constantly threatened to overwhelm her, Emma maintained an air of dignity that came from knowing her own worth, even when the world seemed determined to convince her otherwise. The academic prowess that had earned her a partial scholarship to study agricultural economics was evident in everything she did. Her backpack contained not just textbooks, but carefully organized notes on sustainable farming practices, water conservation techniques, and innovative ranch management strategies that could revolutionize traditional operations. She absorbed knowledge like the parched Colorado soil absorbed rare summer rain, understanding instinctively that education was her only path to a different kind of life. Emma's parents had died in a car accident during her freshman year, leaving her with nothing but their love of the land and a fierce determination to honor their memory through her studies. They had been first-generation immigrants who worked multiple jobs to afford a small house with a garden where they grew vegetables to supplement their grocery budget. From them, Emma had inherited a work ethic that bordered on relentless and a deep understanding of how to make every resource count. Now, 3 years later, she worked 25 hours a week at the Millbrook Valley Community College Library, another 15 hours waiting tables at Murphy's Diner on weekends, and picked up tutoring sessions whenever possible. Her schedule was a carefully orchestrated dance of classes, work shifts, and study time that left little room for the social experiences most college students took for granted. She had learned to survive on 5 hours of sleep and instant ramen, to smile through exhaustion, and to hide her struggles behind a facade of competent self-reliance. The library job provided her with access to agricultural journals and research databases that fed her growing expertise in modern farming techniques. She spent her breaks between shelving books reading about precision agriculture, soil health management, and the integration of technology into traditional ranching operations. Her supervisors had noticed her exceptional organizational skills and her ability to help students with complex research projects, often recommending resources they hadn't even known existed. At Murphy's Diner, Emma had become something of a local fixture. Her ability to remember orders, her genuine interest in customers' lives, and her uncanny knack for suggesting menu items that perfectly matched people's moods had earned her a loyal following among the ranching families who frequented the establishment. She listened to their conversations about cattle prices, weather concerns, and the endless challenges of keeping family operations viable in an increasingly corporate agricultural landscape. These overheard discussions had given Emma insights into the ranching community that her textbooks couldn't provide. She understood the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that successful ranchers had to maintain. The importance of timing in everything from breeding programs to market sales, and the way that weather, economics, and family dynamics all intertwined to determine whether an operation would thrive or merely survive another season. Her tutoring work had connected her with the children of several prominent ranching families, giving her glimpses into homes where agricultural success was measured not just in profit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margins, but in the ability to pass down a way of life to the next generation. She had helped high school students with college applications, understanding better than most the challenges they faced in deciding whether to stay and continue family traditions or leave to pursue different dreams in distant cities. Despite her exhaustion, Emma found energy in her studies that she couldn't summon anywhere else. Her professors had noticed her exceptional grasp of agricultural economics and her innovative approaches to traditional problems. Dr. Patricia Wells, her faculty advisor, had begun including Emma in graduate-level seminars and had hinted at possible research assistantships that could help fund her final year. There was talk of Emma continuing to graduate school, of research opportunities that could lead to positions with the Department of Agriculture or major agricultural corporations. But all of these possibilities seemed increasingly distant as Emma's financial situation grew more precarious. Her student loans had reached their maximum limits, her work-study allocation had been exhausted, and her savings account hovered dangerously close to zero. The partial scholarship that had made college possible covered tuition and fees, but left her responsible for housing, food, transportation, and textbooks. Each semester brought a new financial crisis that required creative solutions and careful budgeting that would have impressed a corporate accountant. The small apartment she rented near campus was a study in efficient use of space. Every piece of furniture served multiple purposes. Every inch had been organized to maximize functionality. Her desk doubled as a dining table. Her bed served as a couch during study sessions, and her closet had been arranged with the precision of a military supply depot. She had learned to cook nutritious meals from basic ingredients, to repair clothing instead of replacing it, and to find free entertainment in the form of campus events and library resources. Emma's social life had become secondary to survival, though she maintained a few close friendships with other students who understood the realities of working their way through college. They formed an informal support network, sharing textbooks, taking turns buying coffee during late-night study sessions, and celebrating small victories like successful exam scores or particularly good tip nights at their various jobs. Her relationship with money had become complicated by necessity. Every purchase required careful consideration, every expense was weighed against alternatives, and every financial decision carried the weight of potential consequences that could derail her carefully constructed plans. She had learned to find satisfaction in small luxuries like a used book from the campus store or a shared meal with friends, understanding that true wealth might come in forms that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The stress of constant financial pressure had taught Emma to be resourceful in ways that would serve her well beyond college. She could stretch a grocery budget further than seemed mathematically possible, negotiate payment plans with landlords, and find scholarship opportunities that other students overlooked. Her applications for financial aid had become works of art, carefully crafted narratives that highlighted her achievements while explaining her circumstances with dignity and hope. Yet beneath her practical exterior, Emma harbored dreams that extended far beyond mere survival. She envisioned herself working with ranching families to implement sustainable practices that would increase profitability while protecting the environment. She imagined developing programs that could help small operations compete with corporate agriculture through innovation and efficiency rather than scale. She dreamed of bridging the gap between academic research and practical application, of finding ways to honor ranching traditions while embracing necessary changes. Her professors had recognized this vision and had begun to involve Emma in discussions about the future of American agriculture. They saw in her a rare combination of theoretical knowledge and practical understanding, someone who could speak the language of both the classroom and the cattle ranch. Dr. Wells had mentioned Emma's name in conversations with industry contacts, preparing the groundwork for internship opportunities that could launch her career in agricultural consulting or policy development. But as her senior year progressed, the gap between Emma's potential and her resources continued to widen. The exhaustion of working multiple jobs while maintaining her academic performance was beginning to show. Her grades remained strong, but she found herself struggling to engage with material that had once energized her, too tired to participate in study groups or research projects that could enhance her prospects after graduation. The weight of financial stress was affecting her health in ways she tried to ignore. She had developed a persistent cough from the stress and late nights, had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and found herself relying on caffeine to maintain the energy needed for her demanding schedule. Her friends had begun to express concern, but Emma deflected their worries with humor and determination, unwilling to admit how close she was to reaching her breaking point. As October winds swept through Millbrook Valley, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the promise of winter's approach, Emma stood at a crossroads that would determine not just her immediate future, but the trajectory of her entire life. The dreams that had sustained her through 3 years of struggle seemed to be slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of choices that no 22-year-old should have to make alone. She had no way of knowing that 30 miles away, another person was facing their own impossible decisions, wrestling with responsibilities that threatened to crush dreams of a different kind. The convergence of their separate struggles would soon create possibilities that neither could have imagined, transforming 2 stories of individual hardship into a single narrative of unexpected hope and mutual salvation. The Broken Creek Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of Colorado rangeland, its boundaries marked by weathered fence posts and the kind of rolling terrain that had drawn cattle ranchers to the valley for generations. From the air, the property would have appeared as a patchwork of pastures, divided by irrigation ditches and dotted with small ponds that reflected the vast sky above. But from ground level, the signs of struggle were impossible to ignore. The main house sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley, its wraparound porch and steep pitched roof speaking to an era when ranching families built homes designed to last for centuries. The structure itself remained sound, but paint peeled from its siding in long strips, and several porch boards had warped enough to create gaps that caught unwary feet. What had once been a symbol of prosperity now bore the unmistakable marks of deferred maintenance and financial strain. David Harper stood on that porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of sunrise that would signal another day of challenges he wasn't sure he could meet. At 35, he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came naturally to men who had spent their lives working with animals and weather, forces that respected strength but demanded patience. His tall frame had been honed by years of physical labor, and his hands bore the calluses and scars that marked a rancher as surely as any brand marked his cattle. The cup of coffee in his hands had grown cold while he wrestled with thoughts that had kept him awake most of the night. Numbers swirled in his mind, each figure representing another piece of the puzzle he couldn't seem to solve. The bank note that came due in 6 months. The equipment loan that required monthly payments he could barely make. The feed bills that arrived with increasing frequency as drought conditions forced him to supplement what his pastures could no longer provide. David had inherited the ranch from his father 2 years earlier, along with debts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of traditional ranching success. The old man had been proud, perhaps too proud, to admit that changing times had left his operation struggling to compete with larger, more efficient enterprises. He had mortgaged the land to upgrade equipment, borrowed against future cattle sales to cover operating expenses, and taken out loans against the value of his herd to pay for his wife's extended medical care during her final battle with cancer. The inheritance that should have been a blessing had become a weight that threatened to crush everything David cared about. He had discovered the true extent of the financial problems only after the funeral, when lawyers and bankers had begun appearing at his door with documents that painted a picture of an operation on the verge of collapse. The ranch that had been in the Harper family for 4 generations was mortgaged to the point where he owned little more than the responsibility to make payments he couldn't afford. Yet David couldn't bring himself to simply walk away. The land held too many memories, too much history, and too much of his identity was tied to the acres his great-grandfather had first claimed in the 1890s. More importantly, the ranch was all that remained of the life he had built with Sarah, the woman he had loved with the kind of completeness that made her loss feel like losing half of himself. Sarah Harper had died 2 years earlier in a car accident that had nothing to do with ranching, and everything to do with the cruel randomness of life. She had been driving home from town after picking up supplies for Sophie's 8th birthday party when a drunk driver ran a red light and ended the future. David had thought they would share. The insurance settlement had helped with immediate expenses, but it had also created a gap in his life that no amount of money could fill. Sophie was the reason David couldn't simply surrender to the financial pressures that mounted with each passing month. At 8 years old, she possessed her mother's bright smile and her father's stubborn determination, along with a love for the ranch that made her the 4th generation of Harpers to claim the land as home. She helped with chores that were appropriate for her age, fed chickens with serious dedication, and talked about the horses and cattle as if they were extended family members. The child had adapted to her mother's absence with the resilience that children sometimes display. But David knew that losing the ranch would be another devastating blow to her sense of security and belonging. Sophie's room was filled with 4-H ribbons from county fairs, photographs of herself with various animals, and drawings of the ranch that showed her vision of home as a place where family and land were inseparably connected. Margaret Harper, Sarah's mother had moved to the ranch after her daughter's death, ostensibly to help care for Sophie while David worked. At 58, she retained the sharp intelligence and organizational skills that had made her successful in her previous career as a high school principal. But retirement and grief had focused those abilities on maintaining control over the domestic sphere of the ranch, with an intensity that sometimes left David feeling like a guest in his own home. Margaret's relationship with David had always been complicated by her conviction that her daughter had married beneath her station. Sarah had been a college graduate with a degree in elementary education, someone who could have chosen a comfortable life in town over the uncertainties of ranching. Margaret had never quite forgiven David for representing the choice that had taken her daughter away from what she considered more suitable prospects. The older woman's grief had crystallized into a rigid set of beliefs about proper behavior and appropriate choices that she applied to every aspect of life on the ranch. She managed the household with military precision, maintained schedules that left little room for spontaneity, and expressed opinions on everything from Sophie's education to David's business decisions with the authority of someone who believed her years of experience teaching teenagers had prepared her to direct adult lives as well. Margaret's presence provided stability for Sophie and practical help that David genuinely needed, but it also created a dynamic where he often felt accountable to someone who had never fully approved of his choices. Her comments about his financial decisions, her suggestions about alternative approaches to ranch management, and her frequent comparisons to how Sarah would have handled various situations served as constant reminders of his failures as both husband and provider. The morning routine that began before sunrise had become David's refuge from the pressures that waited in account books and correspondence. Moving through the barn, in the familiar rhythm of feeding and checking on animals provided a sense of purpose that transcended the anxiety of unpaid bills and uncertain futures. The cattle didn't care about mortgage payments or equipment loans. They simply needed food, water, and attention to their health and comfort. Tom Rodriguez had worked for the Harper family for 15 years, progressing from seasonal help during his college years to the position of ranch foreman that made him David's most trusted advisor and closest friend. At 42, Tom possessed the kind of practical knowledge that came from years of working with cattle in all kinds of weather and market conditions. His loyalty to the Harper family ran deeper than employment. He had been best man at David's wedding and had helped carry Sarah's casket at her funeral. Tom's wife Maria managed the books for several small ranches in the valley, giving her insights into the financial challenges that threatened family operations throughout the region. Her perspective on the Harper Ranch's situation was both professional and personal, colored by genuine affection for David and Sophie, as well as practical understanding of what options might be available to keep the operation viable. The conversations between David and Tom during their morning rounds had evolved over the past months from discussions of routine ranch management to increasingly desperate brainstorming sessions about potential solutions to problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. Tom had suggested everything from diversifying into agritourism to exploring organic certification programs that might command premium prices for their beef. Every potential solution seemed to require either capital they didn't have or time they couldn't afford to invest in uncertain returns. The ranch needed immediate infusions of cash to meet existing obligations while simultaneously requiring long-term strategies that could restore profitability in an increasingly competitive market. The mathematics of their situation were unforgiving, creating a spiral where each month brought them closer to losing everything they were fighting to save. The equipment that filled the ranch's outbuildings told the story of decades of agricultural evolution and the challenges of keeping pace with technological advancement. Tractors that had been state-of-the-art in the 1980s now required constant maintenance to remain functional,
Their replacement costs, measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, that might as well have been millions, given the ranch's current financial position. The irrigation system that distributed water across the pastures represented a similar challenge. Parts of the infrastructure dated to the ranch's earliest days, requiring continuous repair and adjustment to maintain the flow of water that made cattle ranching possible in Colorado's semi-arid climate. Modern precision agriculture techniques could improve efficiency and reduce costs, but the initial investment in new technology required resources that the ranch simply didn't possess. David's education in ranch management had come through experience rather than formal schooling, a common path for ranch children who learned by working alongside their fathers and grandfathers. He understood cattle behavior, grass management, and the countless practical skills required to maintain a ranching operation. But the business side of agriculture had become increasingly complex in ways that his traditional knowledge couldn't address. The regulatory environment that governed ranching had evolved significantly since his father's time, requiring compliance with environmental standards, animal welfare guidelines, and safety requirements that added layers of complexity and cost to operations that had once been much simpler. David found himself spending hours each week on paperwork that his grandfather would have considered an unnecessary burden, but that now represented mandatory aspects of legal ranch operation. Market conditions for cattle had become volatile in ways that made planning extremely difficult. Prices fluctuated, based on factors ranging from international trade agreements to consumer preferences for grass-fed beef, creating an environment where ranchers could find their profit margins eliminated by events entirely beyond their control. The consolidation of meat processing into fewer larger companies had reduced competition for cattle, often leaving ranchers with limited options for selling their products. Feed costs had risen dramatically as drought conditions across the region reduced hay production and forced ranchers to compete for limited supplies of quality forage. The pastures that had once provided most of the nutrition his cattle required now needed expensive supplementation to maintain animal health and weight gain. Each decision about feeding represented a balance between immediate costs and long-term productivity that could determine whether the ranch survived another season. The social fabric of the ranching community had begun to change as financial pressures forced longtime families to sell their operations to corporate buyers or developers who saw the land's value in terms of residential potential rather than agricultural productivity. David attended fewer social gatherings where neighboring ranchers gathered to share information and support each other through difficult times, partly because his own problems left him with little energy for community involvement, and partly because the community itself was disappearing. Sophie's education represented another source of concern and difficult decisions. The local school system served a declining population as rural families moved away or consolidated their children into larger districts that offered more resources but required longer commutes. David wanted to provide his daughter with educational opportunities that would prepare her for any future she might choose. But private school tuition was beyond his reach, and homeschooling would require time and expertise he didn't possess. The child's relationship with the ranch was both heartening and heartbreaking to observe. She moved through the daily routines with enthusiasm and competence that suggested a natural affinity for agricultural life. But David wondered whether encouraging that connection was fair when the ranch's future remained so uncertain. He had seen too many ranching families forced to sell their land and relocate to
towns or cities where their children struggled to adapt to entirely different ways of life. Margaret's influence on Sophie was both stabilizing and limiting, providing structure and educational support while also communicating subtle messages about the importance of having options beyond ranching. The older woman frequently mentioned the advantages of college education and professional careers, particularly for women who shouldn't have to depend on the uncertain economics of agricultural life. Her comments were never direct criticisms of David's choices, but they carried implications that Sophie absorbed along with other lessons about appropriate behavior and future planning. The weight of providing for Sophie's needs while maintaining the ranch created a constant tension in David's decision-making process. Every dollar spent on equipment maintenance was a dollar not available for her clothes, school supplies, or the kind of childhood experiences that required money he couldn't spare. He had learned to be creative in finding free or inexpensive activities they could enjoy together. But he was acutely aware of the limitations his financial situation placed on his ability to give her the kind of security and opportunity that every parent wants to provide. The isolation that came with ranching life had become more pronounced since Sarah's death, leaving David with limited opportunities to build the kind of social connections that might provide emotional support or practical assistance. The demands of caring for cattle and maintaining equipment left little time for developing relationships outside the immediate ranching community. And his financial problems made him reluctant to engage in social activities that might require spending money he couldn't afford. Sleep had become elusive as David's mind raced through potential scenarios for saving the ranch, each possibility seeming to require resources or circumstances that remained frustratingly out of reach. He lay awake calculating the minimum payments needed to keep various creditors satisfied, trying to identify which bills could be delayed and which demanded immediate attention, and wondering whether his determination to preserve the family legacy was ultimately serving Sophie's best interests or simply prolonging an inevitable conclusion. The physical demands of ranch work provided some relief from mental stress, offering the satisfaction of tangible accomplishments in an environment where effort usually produced visible results. Repairing fence, treating sick animals, and maintaining equipment created a sense of forward momentum that contrasted sharply with the feeling of helplessness that accompanied his financial situation. Working with his hands allowed David to feel competent and useful in ways that reviewing account balances never could. Yet even the physical work carried reminders of limitations and constraints. Equipment failures that would have been routine inconveniences in better financial times became crisis situations when replacement parts represented significant expenses and repair delays could affect the health and productivity of animals that depended on consistent care. The ranch's infrastructure demanded continuous investment to remain functional, creating a cycle of maintenance costs that consumed resources faster than the operation could generate income. As autumn deepened into winter, David found himself facing decisions that would determine not just the immediate future of the ranch, but the entire direction of his and Sophie's lives. The numbers that had seemed manageable when spread across hypothetical future months were becoming current obligations that demanded payment in actual dollars he didn't possess. The gap between income and expenses had widened beyond what could be bridged through careful budgeting or temporary sacrifices. The conversations with bankers and creditors that had once been cordial discussions of payment schedules and extension possibilities had taken on a more urgent tone as David's situation became increasingly precarious. The patience that financial institutions had shown in the immediate aftermath of Sarah's death was gradually being replaced by business realities that didn't accommodate personal tragedies or family histories. The ranch that had survived 4 generations of Harpers was approaching a reckoning that would test whether love of the land and determination to preserve family legacy could overcome the mathematical certainties of compound interest and mounting debt. The November morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made breathing painful and turned every surface into a potential hazard. Emma had learned to leave her apartment 30 minutes earlier than necessary during winter months, accounting for the time needed to scrape ice from her car windshield and the slower driving required on roads that the county couldn't afford to salt regularly. Her ancient Honda Civic protested the cold with reluctant engine turns and a heater that took miles to produce anything resembling warm air. She had worked a double shift at Murphy's Diner the night before, staying until nearly midnight to help with a private party that had promised good tips but delivered mostly demanding customers and minimal gratuity. Her body ached from hours of carrying heavy trays and standing on her feet, but the exhaustion was familiar enough to push through as she prepared for another day of classes followed by her evening shift at the library. The highway between her apartment and the community college campus wound through rangeland that stretched toward the foothills, offering views of snow-capped peaks that would have been breathtaking if Emma hadn't been too tired and worried to appreciate them. Instead, she found herself calculating gas mileage and wondering whether the strange noise her car had started making indicated an expensive repair she couldn't afford. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord requesting a meeting about her lease renewal, a message that sent a spike of anxiety through her already stressed system. Rent increases were common enough, but any change to her carefully balanced budget could tip her financial situation from precarious to impossible. She had been late with rent twice in the past 6 months, both times managing to scrape together the money through extra tutoring sessions and borrowed funds from classmates who understood her situation. The community college where Emma worked sat on the outskirts of Millbrook Valley, its modern buildings serving students from several rural counties who commuted from distances that would have surprised urban dwellers. The library where she spent her work-study hours had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in agricultural research between helping students with their assignments and maintaining the quiet efficiency that made her indispensable to the staff. Dr. Patricia Wells had scheduled a meeting with Emma that morning to discuss her thesis project, a comprehensive analysis of sustainable ranching practices that could help small operations compete with corporate agriculture. The project represented Emma's best opportunity to demonstrate her expertise to potential employers, but it also required field research and data collection that would be difficult to complete given her work schedule and limited transportation options. Emma arrived at the library 20 minutes before her shift began, using the extra time to review her notes and prepare for the conversation that could determine whether her academic work would lead to meaningful career opportunities or simply remain an expensive exercise in theoretical knowledge. Dr. Wells had hinted at potential connections with ranching operations that might be willing to serve as case studies, but Emma knew that such opportunities often went to students whose schedules allowed for more flexibility and whose financial situations didn't require them to work multiple jobs. The meeting took place in Dr. Wells' cramped office, which was lined with agricultural journals and filled with the accumulated detritus of decades spent studying land use patterns and rural economics. The professor was a woman in her early 60s who had grown up on a wheat farm in eastern Colorado before pursuing graduate education that led to her current position. Her understanding of agricultural life was both academic and personal, making her Emma's most valuable mentor and advocate. Your preliminary research is exceptional, Dr. Wells began, reviewing the folder of materials Emma had submitted. The correlation you've identified between water conservation practices and long-term profitability could have significant implications for policy development. But we need to move from theoretical analysis to practical application if you want this work to make a real impact. Emma nodded, though she felt the familiar tension that accompanied discussions of opportunities that seemed designed for students whose circumstances differed significantly from her own. I've been researching ranching operations in the valley that might be willing to participate in the study, but most of my contact attempts haven't been successful. I think they're skeptical about working with college students, especially on projects that might expose their financial information. Dr. Wells leaned back in her chair, studying Emma with the kind of assessment that made students feel simultaneously evaluated and understood. That's exactly the challenge we need to address. Ranchers are practical people who've been approached by plenty of researchers offering theoretical solutions to real-world problems. They need to see evidence that you understand their actual concerns and can provide insights that will help their operations become more profitable. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Dr. Wells outlining potential approaches to gaining access to ranching operations that could serve as case studies. She mentioned several families in the valley who had expressed interest in innovative approaches to traditional challenges, though she was careful to note that their participation would depend on Emma's ability to demonstrate genuine value rather than academic curiosity. There's one situation that might be particularly relevant to your research, Dr. Wells said as their meeting neared its end. The Harper Ranch has been in the same family for 4 generations, but they're facing the kind of financial pressures that are forcing many traditional operations out of business. If they were willing to work with you, it could provide exactly the kind of data you need while potentially helping them develop strategies for long-term sustainability. Emma felt a surge of interest mixed with apprehension. Working with a struggling ranch could provide invaluable insights for her research, but it would also require a level of time and commitment that her current schedule made nearly impossible. Do you think they'd be open to working with a student? Most ranchers seem to prefer dealing with established consultants or government agencies. Dr. Wells smiled with the kind of expression that suggested she had been anticipating this question. David Harper is different from some of the older ranchers in the valley. He's facing challenges that traditional approaches can't solve, which makes him more open to innovative strategies. His operation is sophisticated enough to provide meaningful data, but small enough that your research could actually influence their decision-making process. The possibility of working with a real ranching operation excited Emma in ways that surprised her with their intensity. After months of studying agricultural economics in the abstract, the opportunity to apply her knowledge to actual problems felt like a validation of everything she had worked toward. But the practical obstacles remained formidable, requiring her to somehow balance field research with her existing commitments while managing transportation and time challenges that could make the project impossible to complete. Emma's afternoon classes passed in a blur of agricultural policy discussions and statistical analysis that felt both relevant and distant from the immediate concerns that occupied her thoughts. Her classmates discussed internship opportunities and graduate school applications with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing their families would provide financial support through whatever transition periods might be required. Emma participated in these conversations while mentally calculating whether she could afford the application fees for the programs they discussed so freely. The library shift that followed her classes provided some relief from academic pressures, offering the familiar routine of checking in returned books, helping students locate research materials, and maintaining the quiet atmosphere that made the space conducive to serious study. Emma had developed a reputation among regular users as someone who could locate obscure resources and suggest research strategies that other staff members might not consider. During a quiet period between students seeking assistance, Emma found herself researching the Harper Ranch online, looking for information that might help her understand their operation and the challenges they faced. The results were limited, consisting mainly of historical references to the ranch's establishment in the 1890s and occasional mentions in local newspaper coverage of county fair competitions and community events. What emerged from her research was a picture of a traditional ranching family that had maintained their operation through multiple generations of economic changes and agricultural evolution. The Harper name appeared regularly in connection with local agricultural organizations and community leadership roles, suggesting a level of involvement and respect that went beyond simple property ownership. Emma's shift ended at 9 o'clock, leaving her with just enough energy to drive home and prepare for another day of classes and work that would begin in less than 8 hours. Her apartment felt cold and empty, lacking the warmth and security that she remembered from her parents' home but couldn't afford to recreate on her current budget. She heated a can of soup for dinner while reviewing her notes from Dr. Wells' meeting and trying to imagine how she might approach the Harper Ranch about participating in her research. The idea of cold calling a ranching family to request access to their financial information and operational data seemed presumptuous in ways that made Emma question her own qualifications and authority. She was, after all, just a college student whose knowledge of ranching came primarily from textbooks and academic journals rather than practical experience. What could she possibly offer to people who had spent their lives working with cattle and managing land? Yet Dr. Wells' confidence in both the project's value and Emma's ability to execute it suggested that her academic preparation might translate into practical insights that could benefit real ranching operations. The sustainable practices she had studied in theory could potentially help struggling ranches reduce costs and improve efficiency in ways that would directly impact their profitability and long-term viability. Emma spent the evening drafting and redrafting an email to David Harper, trying to strike a balance between professional competence and appropriate humility that would make her request seem reasonable rather than presumptuous. She explained her research project, outlined the potential benefits of participation, and offered to provide a detailed proposal that would demonstrate her serious commitment to producing valuable results. The message went through multiple revisions as Emma struggled to present herself as both academically qualified and practically minded, someone who understood that ranching operations were businesses rather than subjects for abstract study.
She emphasized her genuine interest in helping traditional ranches adapt to changing economic conditions while preserving the values and practices that made them important parts of rural communities. After sending the email, Emma lay awake wondering whether she had made a mistake in reaching out to the Harper Ranch or whether the opportunity might represent exactly the kind of break she needed to transform her academic work into practical career preparation. The uncertainty was familiar but exhausting, adding another layer of stress to an already overwhelming schedule that left little room for the kind of focused research that her thesis project would require. Meanwhile, 30 miles away at the Broken Creek Ranch, David Harper was experiencing his own sleepless night for entirely different reasons. The conversation with his banker earlier that day had been more direct and less encouraging than previous discussions about payment schedules and extension options. The institution that had worked with the Harper family for decades was facing its own pressures from federal regulators and corporate ownership changes that made accommodation of struggling agricultural accounts increasingly difficult to justify. The numbers that had seemed manageable when spread across hypothetical future months were becoming current obligations that demanded payment in actual dollars. Equipment payments, feed bills, property taxes, and insurance costs created a monthly total that exceeded the ranch's income by margins that could no longer be bridged through creative accounting or optimistic projections about cattle prices. Tom Rodriguez had stayed late to help David review their options, spreading financial documents across the kitchen table while Margaret supervised Sophie's homework in the living room. The foreman's loyalty extended far beyond his job description, making him more of a partner than an employee in the struggle to find solutions that could keep the ranch operational for another season. "We could sell the south pasture," Tom suggested, though his tone indicated little enthusiasm for the idea. "Jake Morrison has been asking about it for years, and he'd probably pay market value without requiring a lengthy negotiation process." David considered the suggestion while staring at papers that seemed to multiply problems faster than solutions could be identified. Selling part of the ranch would provide immediate cash to address pressing obligations, but it would also reduce the operation's carrying capacity and eliminate future income potential in ways that could make the remaining land insufficient to support a viable ranching operation. "That pasture generates about 15% of our annual income," David replied. "Selling it might solve this year's problems, but it would make next year's situation worse. We'd be trading long-term viability for short-term survival." The alternatives they discussed were equally problematic, requiring either capital they didn't possess or sacrifices that would fundamentally change the nature of their operation. Diversification into agritourism could provide additional income streams, but it would require infrastructure investments and marketing expertise that the ranch couldn't afford to develop. Organic certification might command premium prices for their beef, but the transition period would be costly and the market uncertain. Margaret's voice carried from the living room where she was helping Sophie with mathematics homework, her patient explanations of fractions and percentages providing a domestic counterpoint to the financial calculations that consumed David's attention. The older woman's presence in their home was both helpful and complicating, offering practical support while also serving as a constant reminder of Sarah's absence and the stability that had died with her. The child's laughter at something Margaret had said created a moment of lightness that contrasted sharply with the gravity of decisions that would determine her future. David found himself wondering whether his determination to preserve the family ranch was ultimately serving Sophie's best interests or simply postponing an inevitable conclusion that would be more difficult the longer he delayed accepting it. The email notification on his phone provided a welcome distraction from thoughts that had been circling through the same problems without generating new solutions. Emma Chen's message appeared among routine correspondence from feed suppliers and equipment dealers, its subject line mentioning research collaboration rather than past due payments or collection proceedings. David read the email twice, trying to understand what a college student studying agricultural economics could possibly offer to a ranching operation that was struggling with problems that had defeated generations of practical experience. The idea of opening his financial records to academic scrutiny seemed both embarrassing and potentially useless, another distraction from the immediate concerns that demanded his attention. Yet something in Emma's message suggested a level of seriousness and practical understanding that differentiated her approach from the academic curiosity he had encountered in previous contacts with university researchers. Her emphasis on sustainable profitability and long-term viability indicated an awareness that ranching operations were businesses rather than subjects for theoretical study. Tom read the email over David's shoulder, offering the kind of perspective that came from years of watching their operations struggle with challenges that traditional approaches couldn't solve. Might be worth talking to her, the foreman suggested. We've tried everything else, and some of these college programs have access to government resources and grant opportunities that we wouldn't know about otherwise. The idea of working with a student researcher wasn't particularly appealing, but David found himself considering the possibility that fresh eyes and academic training might identify opportunity or solutions that had escaped his notice. Emma's research focus on sustainable ranching practices aligned with concerns that had occupied his thoughts as he watched other operations in the valley succumb to economic pressures that seemed to intensify each year. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, having finished helping Sophie with her homework and apparently drawn by the serious tone of their conversation. Her expression showed the kind of careful attention she gave to any development that might affect the ranch's stability or Sophie's security, making her both ally and judge in decisions that would determine their family's future. "What's this about?" she asked, noting the papers scattered across the table and the laptop displaying Emma's email. David explained the student's request while watching Margaret's face for signs of the skepticism he expected her to express about involving outsiders in their private business affairs. To his surprise, Margaret's response was more measured than dismissive. "Education and fresh perspectives can be valuable," she said carefully. "But you need to be certain that any information you share won't be used in ways that could damage the ranch's reputation or create additional problems with creditors or regulatory agencies." The practical concerns Margaret raised were legitimate, requiring David to consider not just the potential benefits of participating in Emma's research but also the risks that might accompany academic scrutiny of their operation. Ranching was a business that depended heavily on relationships and reputation, making any public examination of financial difficulties potentially damaging to future prospects. Sophie wandered into the kitchen, drawn by adult conversation that seemed more interesting than her usual bedtime routine. At 8 years old, she had developed an acute sensitivity to the tensions and concerns that occupied the adults in her life, though she rarely asked direct questions about problems she sensed but couldn't fully understand. "Is someone coming to visit the ranch?" she asked, having overheard enough of their conversation to gather that they were discussing a potential visitor. Her enthusiasm for meeting new people reflected both her naturally social personality and the isolation that came with living in a remote location where meaningful contact with peers required significant effort to arrange. David found himself reluctant to explain the full context of Emma's request, unwilling to burden his daughter with knowledge of their financial difficulties, while also uncertain whether the proposed research collaboration would actually materialize into anything meaningful. "Maybe," he said. "We're still deciding whether it would be helpful." The non-committal answer satisfied Sophie's curiosity without creating expectations that might not be fulfilled, allowing her to return to her bedtime preparations while the adults continued their discussion of whether to respond positively to Emma's email. The decision seemed both simple and momentous, representing either a waste of time they couldn't afford or an opportunity that could provide exactly the kind of outside perspective their situation required. David's response to Emma's email arrived 3 days later, brief and businesslike in tone but containing an invitation that made her heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. He suggested they meet at Murphy's Diner on Saturday morning to discuss her research proposal, a location that would allow them to talk privately while remaining in the neutral territory of a public space. Emma read the message several times, searching for clues about his level of interest or skepticism, but the carefully polite language revealed nothing beyond his willingness to listen. Saturday morning found Emma arriving at Murphy's 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review her notes and prepare for a conversation that could determine whether her thesis project would move forward or remain an academic exercise without practical application. She had spent the previous evening organizing her research materials and rehearsing potential responses to questions she anticipated David might ask about her qualifications, methodology, and intended use of any information he might share. The diner buzzed with its typical weekend breakfast crowd, ranching families and local residents gathering over coffee and pancakes to discuss weather conditions, cattle prices, and community news. Emma recognized several customers from her shift's waiting tables, though she felt odd encountering them in her role as student researcher rather than server. The familiar environment provided some comfort, but the upcoming meeting created nervous energy that made sitting still nearly impossible. David Harper entered at exactly 10 o'clock, scanning the dining room until his eyes met Emma's across the crowded space. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent working outdoors, and moved with the quiet confidence that characterized men accustomed to handling large animals and unpredictable situations. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his initial assessment of her seemed both professional and slightly cautious. They found a booth near the back of the restaurant where their conversation would be less likely to be overheard by other customers, though Emma suspected that her presence with David Harper would generate speculation regardless of their attempts at privacy. Small communities thrived on such observations, and she could already sense curious glances from other diners who were wondering about the nature of their meeting.
Explaining her research project in more detail than her email had allowed, outlining her interest in sustainable ranching practices, and her belief that small family operations could remain competitive through innovative approaches to traditional challenges. David listened carefully, asking occasional questions that revealed his practical understanding of the topics she discussed and his skepticism about academic solutions to real-world problems. Most researchers I've met want to study ranching operations like we're specimens in a laboratory, David said during a pause in Emma's presentation. They collect their data, write their papers, and move on to the next project without any concern for whether their recommendations are actually practical or affordable for working ranches. Emma felt the sting of his criticism while recognizing its validity. She had encountered similar attitudes in her academic work, where theoretical solutions often ignored the financial and logistical constraints that governed actual agricultural operations. That's exactly what I want to avoid, she replied carefully. I'm not interested in writing recommendations that look good on paper, but can't be implemented in reality. I want to understand what actually works for ranchers who are dealing with real economic pressures. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from Emma's academic background to David's family history with the ranch and the specific challenges he faced in maintaining the operation's viability. Emma found herself impressed by his depth of knowledge about agricultural markets, environmental regulations, and the complex web of relationships that determine success or failure in the ranching business. David's assessment of Emma evolved as their discussion progressed, revealing her genuine understanding of agricultural economics and her practical awareness of the constraints that governed ranching decisions. Her questions demonstrated familiarity with issues he faced daily, and her suggestions showed consideration for the financial realities that academic researchers often ignored in their theoretical approaches to problem solving. The turning point in their conversation came when Emma mentioned her parents' background and her own experience working multiple jobs to pay for college. David's expression softened as he recognized something of his own struggles in her description of balancing competing demands while trying to preserve long-term goals that sometimes seemed impossibly distant. Most college students I know have their education paid for by parents or trust funds, David observed. They study agriculture like it's an interesting theoretical exercise, rather than something that determines whether families can keep their homes and communities can survive. Emma nodded, understanding the distinction he was making between academic curiosity and personal investment in the outcomes of agricultural policy decisions. Her own financial struggles had given her a perspective on economic insecurity that her classmates often lacked, making her research feel personally relevant rather than merely intellectually stimulating. When David finally agreed to allow Emma access to his ranch records and operations, the decision seemed to emerge naturally from their extended conversation rather than representing a dramatic moment of commitment. He outlined conditions for her research that emphasized confidentiality and practical value, making it clear that he expected her work to produce insights that could actually help his operation rather than simply serve her academic requirements. Emma's excitement about the opportunity was tempered by anxiety about the additional time commitment it would require, and the pressure to produce results that would justify David's trust in her abilities. She had never worked directly with a struggling business where her recommendations could have immediate consequences for real people's lives and livelihoods. Their meeting concluded with an agreement that Emma would spend the following weekend at the ranch, reviewing financial records and observing operations to gain the first-hand understanding that would inform her research. David provided directions to the ranch and suggested that she arrive early Saturday morning to maximize the time available for her data collection and observation. The drive back to her apartment gave Emma time to process the implications of the commitment she had made, both the opportunities it represented and the challenges it would create for her already overwhelming schedule. She would need to request time off from her weekend shift at Murphy's Diner, arrange transportation for the 40-minute drive to the ranch, and somehow balance the additional workload with her existing academic and employment responsibilities. Dr. Wells' reaction to news of David's agreement was enthusiastic and slightly envious, expressing her own interest in the research opportunity while warning Emma about the responsibilities that accompanied access to confidential business information. The professor emphasized the importance of maintaining professional boundaries while building the trust necessary for meaningful collaboration with research subjects who were sharing sensitive financial data. Emma spent the week preparing for her visit to the Broken Creek Ranch, researching comparable operations and developing a framework for analyzing the information David would share with her. She created detailed spreadsheets for recording financial data, prepared questions about operational procedures, and outlined potential areas where sustainable practices might be implemented without requiring significant capital investments. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Colorado's reputation for natural beauty seem understated rather than exaggerated. Emma's elderly Honda Civic protested the early hour and the unfamiliar route, but managed the drive to the ranch without the mechanical failures she had learned to expect from her unreliable transportation. The Broken Creek Ranch revealed itself gradually as Emma followed the gravel road that wound through pastures where cattle grazed against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. The scale of the operation impressed her, though she could see evidence of the financial constraints that David had described in their meeting. Equipment showed signs of age and heavy use, fencing needed repairs in several locations, and outbuildings displayed the kind of deferred maintenance that indicated cash flow problems. The ranch house stood on a slight rise overlooking the valley, its wraparound porch and traditional architecture speaking to an era when ranching families built homes designed to last for generations. David emerged from the house as Emma parked her car, followed by a young girl who studied their visitor with the frank curiosity that characterized children encountering unfamiliar adults in their familiar environment. "This is my daughter Sophie," David said by way of introduction. "Sophie, this is Miss Chen, the student researcher I told you about." Sophie Harper possessed her father's direct gaze and an 8-year-old's lack of inhibition about asking personal questions. "Are you going to help Daddy save the ranch?" she asked before anyone could suggest more conventional conversational topics. Emma felt the weight of expectations she hadn't fully understood before arriving at the ranch, realizing that her research project carried implications for this child's future that extended far beyond academic requirements or career development. "I'm going to try to learn about your ranch and see if there are ways to make it more successful," she replied carefully. Margaret Harper appeared on the porch, introducing herself with the kind of polite formality that suggested both welcome and evaluation. Emma sensed immediately that the older woman represented a different kind of authority within the family structure, someone whose approval would be necessary for any recommendations to be seriously considered or implemented. The tour of the ranch facilities took most of the morning, with David explaining the operation's layout, animal management practices, and seasonal routines while Emma took detailed notes and photographs. She found herself impressed by the sophistication of their approach to cattle breeding, pasture rotation, and animal health management, though she could see opportunities for efficiency improvements that might reduce costs without compromising quality. Sophie accompanied them throughout the tour, offering commentary about her favorite animals and demonstrating her knowledge of ranching procedures with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested genuine affection for agricultural life. Her presence reminded Emma constantly of the personal stakes involved in the ranch's financial struggles and the human consequences of whatever recommendations she might eventually make. The afternoon was spent reviewing financial records that painted a stark picture of an operation caught between rising costs and stagnant revenues. Emma's academic training had prepared her to analyze agricultural economics in theoretical terms, but seeing the actual numbers that determined whether a family could keep their home added emotional weight to mathematical calculations. David's willingness to share such sensitive information reflected either desperation or trust that Emma found both flattering and intimidating. The profit margins were smaller than her textbooks had suggested were sustainable, and the debt load was larger than conventional wisdom indicated any agricultural operation could successfully manage. Yet Emma also saw opportunities for improvement that David's proximity to daily operations might have prevented him from recognizing. His feeding program, while adequate for maintaining animal health, could be optimized to reduce costs while improving weight gain. His breeding decisions, though based on sound principles, weren't taking advantage of genetic improvements that could significantly enhance herd productivity. More importantly, David wasn't utilizing available government programs and tax incentives that could provide substantial financial relief for operations implementing conservation practices. Emma's academic research had made her aware of funding opportunities that many ranchers never discovered, grants and cost-sharing programs that could offset the initial expenses of implementing sustainable practices. As the day progressed, Emma found herself developing genuine admiration for David's dedication to preserving his family's ranching legacy while providing stability for his daughter. His knowledge of agricultural practices was extensive, and his commitment to animal welfare was evident in every aspect of his operation. The financial problems he faced were largely the result of external economic forces rather than mismanagement or poor decision-making. Margaret's role in the ranch's operations became clearer as Emma observed the family's interactions throughout the day. The older woman managed household finances with the same attention to detail she had once applied to school administration, and her insights about operational efficiency were often more practical than David's focus on maintaining traditional practices. Sophie's attachment to ranch life was evident in her easy familiarity with animals and equipment, her competent performance of age-appropriate chores, and her obvious pride in explaining various aspects of their operation to their visitor. Emma recognized in the child's enthusiasm the same connection to agricultural life that had motivated her own academic interest in sustainable ranching practices. The evening meal provided an opportunity for more relaxed conversation about Emma's background, her career goals, and her perspective on the challenges facing small ranching operations. Margaret's questions revealed both curiosity about Emma's qualifications and subtle concern about the practical value of academic research for their specific situation. David's assessment of Emma had evolved throughout the day from cautious skepticism to genuine interest in her insights and recommendations. Her questions demonstrated understanding of operational details that many researchers missed, and her suggestions showed consideration for the financial constraints that governed his decision-making process. As Emma prepared to leave the ranch that evening, David made an unexpected proposal that would change the trajectory of both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The suggestion emerged from their discussion of her research timeline and the logistical challenges of conducting thorough analysis while managing her existing academic and work commitments. "You could stay here while you complete your research," David said, his tone carefully casual. "We have a guest room that isn't being used, and it would give you better access to the information you need while saving you the time and gas money for repeated trips." Emma felt her heart skip as she considered the implications of his offer, both the practical advantages it would provide for her research and the potential complications it might create in terms of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Living at the ranch would certainly make her data collection more efficient and comprehensive, but it would also place her in close proximity to a family whose personal struggles were becoming increasingly important to her. Margaret's expression suggested that the invitation had not been discussed in advance, though her reaction seemed more surprised than disapproving. Sophie's immediate enthusiasm for having a guest provided a child's perspective on the proposal that was refreshingly uncomplicated by adult concerns about propriety or professional relationships. Emma's acceptance of David's invitation was influenced by practical considerations as much as personal interest, though she was beginning to acknowledge that her feelings about the Harper family extended beyond academic curiosity. The opportunity to conduct intensive research while reducing her living expenses was too valuable to decline, even if it meant navigating social dynamics that her academic training hadn't prepared her to handle. The arrangements they worked out over the following week reflected David's need for practical assistance as much as Emma's need for research access. She would help with ranch bookkeeping and administrative tasks in exchange for room and board, while also working on her thesis project and maintaining her part-time job at the community college library. Margaret's initial reservations about the arrangement were gradually overcome by Emma's obvious competence and her positive influence on Sophie, who responded to having another adult woman in the house, with an enthusiasm that revealed how much she had missed that kind of presence since her mother's death. Emma's first week at the ranch established routines that felt surprisingly natural despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. She worked on her research during morning hours, helped with ranch administration during the afternoon, and assisted Sophie with homework in the evening. The arrangement provided benefits for everyone involved while creating a domestic dynamic that was both comfortable and slightly surreal. David found himself relying on Emma's assistance with paperwork and financial analysis in ways that went beyond their original agreement, discovering that her academic training translated into practical skills that his operation desperately needed. Her ability to organize information, identify patterns in data, and communicate complex ideas clearly made her an invaluable addition to his limited support staff. The growing personal connection between David and Emma developed gradually through shared meals, evening conversations about ranch management, and the easy familiarity that came from living in the same household. Neither acknowledged the attraction that was becoming increasingly obvious to Margaret and Tom, though both seemed to find excuses for spending time together that weren't strictly necessary for either research purposes or ranch operations. Emma's analysis of the ranch's financial situation led to recommendations that went far beyond the scope of her original thesis project. She identified cost-saving opportunities, potential new revenue streams, and available assistance programs that could provide both immediate relief and long-term sustainability for the operation. More importantly, her presence in the household had brought a sense of energy and possibility that had been missing since Sarah's death. Sophie's academic performance improved with Emma's tutoring assistance, Margaret's household management became more efficient with an additional pair of hands, and David's stress level decreased as he shared the burden of administrative responsibilities with someone who understood both the challenges and the potential solutions. The arrangement that had begun as mutual convenience was evolving into something more meaningful for all parties involved, though none of them were quite ready to acknowledge the personal dimensions of what was happening beneath the surface of their professional relationship. Emma's financial situation had improved dramatically through the elimination of rent and food expenses, allowing her to focus on her studies without the constant stress of making ends meet. The change in her circumstances was visible in her improved health, her increased energy, and her renewed enthusiasm for academic work that had begun to feel burdensome when combined with multiple jobs. David's reliance on Emma's assistance had grown beyond what either had initially anticipated, making him aware of how much his operation needed the kind of modern business practices and technological integration that she brought to their traditional methods. Her contributions to ranch efficiency were saving money and time while improving record-keeping and decision-making processes. The emotional attachment that was developing between David and Emma was complicated by the practical nature of their arrangement and the awareness that her research project would eventually end, requiring decisions about whether their relationship would continue beyond its original academic framework. Sophie's affection for Emma had grown to the point where the child clearly viewed her as a permanent addition to their family, making casual references to future plans that included Emma's continued presence at the ranch.
The 8-year-old's assumptions about their living arrangement reflected a child's perspective on relationships that was both innocent and perceptive. Margaret's assessment of the situation had evolved from cautious approval to genuine appreciation for Emma's positive influence on the household, though the older woman was careful not to express expectations about permanent arrangements that might not materialize. As winter deepened and Emma's research neared completion, the temporary nature of their arrangement created tension that none of them wanted to address directly. The success of their collaboration had made the prospect of returning to previous living situations seem less appealing for everyone involved, though professional boundaries and social expectations created complications that prevented easy solutions. The crisis that would force them to confront their feelings arrived in the form of a registered letter from the bank, informing David that his loan extensions had reached their limit and that foreclosure proceedings would begin unless full payment was received within 30 days. The amount due was far beyond anything his ranch could generate through conventional means, even with the efficiency improvements Emma had implemented. Emma's response to the foreclosure notice was both professional and personal, reflecting her investment in the ranch's success as both research subject and place that had become home. Her analysis of potential solutions included options that went beyond traditional agricultural financing, incorporating her knowledge of government programs and alternative funding sources that might provide the resources needed to save the operation. The desperation that accompanied the foreclosure threat led David to consider alternatives that he had previously dismissed, including Emma's suggestions about diversifying ranch operations and exploring new markets for their products. More importantly, it forced him to acknowledge how much her presence had meant to his family's well-being and his own sense of hope about their future. The proposal that emerged from their crisis was both practical and romantic, reflecting the genuine affection that had developed between them while addressing the financial realities that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. David's suggestion that they consider marriage was framed in terms of mutual benefit rather than declarations of love, though the emotional undercurrents were obvious to everyone involved. Emma's acceptance of his proposal was influenced by practical considerations as much as personal feelings. Though she had come to care deeply about David, Sophie, and the ranch that had become more meaningful to her than any academic project could have been. The arrangement they negotiated would provide her with the financial security she needed to complete her education while giving David access to her skills and knowledge on a permanent basis. Margaret's approval of their engagement reflected her recognition that Emma's influence on their family had been entirely positive and that the practical benefits of their partnership extended far beyond romance. The older woman's blessing carried weight that helped legitimize an arrangement that might otherwise have seemed too convenient to be believable. Sophie's excitement about gaining Emma as a stepmother was uncomplicated by adult concerns about the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. The child's enthusiasm provided a reminder that love and family could emerge from unexpected situations and that practical arrangements could evolve into genuine emotional connections. The wedding that took place 6 months later was a simple ceremony that reflected their shared values and the community that had come to accept their relationship as both practical and romantic. The financial assistance that Emma brought to their marriage, combined with the government funding she had secured for ranch improvements, provided the resources needed to save the operation while establishing a foundation for long-term prosperity. Their partnership proved successful in ways that exceeded both their initial expectations and their most optimistic projections. Emma's expertise in sustainable agriculture and modern business practices transformed the ranch's efficiency, while David's experience and local connections provided the foundation for implementing changes that might have failed without his credibility within the ranching community. The success of their collaboration attracted attention from other struggling ranchers who sought Emma's assistance with their own operations, leading to consulting opportunities that provided additional income while allowing her to apply her academic training to practical problems throughout the valley. Her reputation as someone who understood both theoretical principles and operational constraints made her a valuable resource for ranchers facing similar challenges. Sophie's development under Emma's influence reflected the positive impact of having a stable, educated woman in her life who could provide both academic support and emotional guidance. The child's performance in school improved dramatically, and her confidence in her own abilities grew as she received encouragement for both traditional ranch skills and academic achievement. Margaret's role in their household evolved to reflect the addition of another adult woman who could share domestic responsibilities while bringing different strengths and perspectives to family management. The older woman's experience in Emma's education created a combination that benefited everyone in the household. David's transformation from a struggling rancher facing foreclosure to a successful operator implementing innovative practices reflected both Emma's contributions and his own willingness to adapt traditional methods to changing circumstances. Their partnership demonstrated that combining respect for agricultural traditions with openness to new approaches could create opportunities for small family ranches to thrive in competitive markets. The ranch that had been on the verge of bankruptcy became a model for sustainable practices that other operations sought to emulate, generating income through consulting fees and speaking engagements that supplemented their agricultural revenues. Emma's academic credentials and David's practical experience created a combination that was uniquely valuable to ranching families throughout the region. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement to address mutual needs, developed into a genuine partnership that served as the foundation for both personal happiness and professional success. The love that grew between them was built on shared values, mutual respect, and the satisfaction of working together toward common goals that benefited their family and their community. The story of their unconventional courtship became part of local folklore, inspiring other struggling individuals to consider creative solutions to problems that conventional approaches couldn't solve. Their example demonstrated that practical arrangements could evolve into meaningful relationships when based on genuine compatibility and shared commitment to each other's well-being. Years later, as Emma stood in the same spot where she had first toured the ranch as a nervous college student, she could see the transformation that their partnership had created. The property that had been struggling with deferred maintenance and financial pressure now showed signs of prosperity and long-term planning that reflected both their hard work and their successful collaboration. The cattle that grazed in improved pastures represented not just agricultural success but the preservation of a way of life that had seemed destined for extinction. Their operation had become proof that family ranches could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining the values and traditions that made them important parts of rural communities. Sophie, now a teenager, moved through the ranch with the competence and confidence that came from growing up in a stable, supportive environment where her contributions were valued and her future possibilities were unlimited. Her plans for college and career reflected both the agricultural knowledge she had gained from ranch life and the academic opportunities that Emma's influence had made accessible. The financial security that their marriage had provided allowed Emma to complete her education and pursue graduate studies that enhanced her ability to serve other ranching families facing similar challenges. Her thesis project had evolved into a career that combined academic research with practical consulting, creating value for both the university and the agricultural community. David's leadership in local agricultural organizations reflected his transformation from someone struggling to save his own operation
To someone helping other ranchers navigate the challenges of modern agriculture. His credibility came from having faced the same problems his neighbors confronted and having found solutions that worked in real-world conditions. Margaret's satisfaction with the arrangement was evident in her continued involvement in ranch operations and her pride in the family's success. Her initial skepticism about Emma's place in their household had been replaced by genuine appreciation for the stability and prosperity that their partnership had created. The love that had grown between David and Emma was visible in their easy collaboration, their shared decision-making, and their obvious contentment with the life they had built together. Their relationship had proven that practical partnerships could evolve into romantic connections when based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being and happiness. The morning after the foreclosure notice arrived brought no relief from the crushing weight of impending financial disaster. David found himself standing in the barn before dawn, going through the motions of feeding cattle while his mind raced through calculations that always reached the same impossible conclusion. 30 days to produce $400,000, a sum that might as well have been $4 million given his current resources and prospects. Emma had spent the night poring over financial documents and government program databases, her laptop glowing in the guest bedroom as she searched for solutions that conventional wisdom insisted didn't exist. Her academic training had taught her that complex problems rarely had simple answers, but she had also learned that systematic analysis could sometimes reveal opportunities that desperation and panic obscured. The breakfast table that morning was unusually quiet, with Sophie sensing the adult tension without understanding its source, and Margaret maintaining the kind of careful composure that suggested she was preparing for the worst possible outcome. The elderly woman had lived through enough family crises to recognize when optimism was no longer sufficient to address reality, and her practical nature was already calculating what salvage might be possible from the wreckage of their situation. Tom Rodriguez arrived earlier than usual, having heard rumors in town about the Harper Ranch's financial difficulties that made him want to offer whatever support his presence could provide. The foreman's loyalty extended far beyond professional obligations, making him more of a brother than an employee in David's struggle to find solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. Emma's announcement that she had found potential alternatives to foreclosure was met with the kind of cautious skepticism that people develop when hope has been repeatedly disappointed. Her research had identified a combination of government assistance programs, agricultural grants, and tax incentive opportunities that could potentially address both immediate cash flow needs and long-term sustainability challenges. The complexity of the solutions Emma had discovered reflected the Byzantine nature of agricultural support systems that had evolved over decades of political compromise and bureaucratic layering. Conservation Reserve Program payments could provide immediate income while reducing operational costs. Environmental Quality Incentives Program funding could offset infrastructure improvements while qualifying the ranch for additional tax benefits. Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program grants could support diversification efforts that would create new revenue streams. David's initial reaction to Emma's proposals was colored by his experience with government programs that promised more than they delivered and required paperwork that consumed time he couldn't spare. His skepticism was reinforced by conversations with other ranchers who had spent months navigating bureaucratic processes, only to discover that funding had been exhausted or that their operations didn't quite meet eligibility requirements. Emma's response to his doubts demonstrated both her understanding of his concerns and her confidence in the thoroughness of her research. She had not simply identified potential programs but had contacted program administrators to verify availability, confirmed eligibility requirements, and developed a timeline for applications that would maximize their chances of success while meeting the bank's deadline for payment. The credibility that Emma's academic credentials provided proved crucial in her communications with government officials who might have been less responsive to inquiries from struggling ranchers seeking assistance. Her ability to speak the language of agricultural policy and environmental science opened doors that David's practical experience alone couldn't access, creating opportunities for funding that required both technical expertise and bureaucratic navigation skills. Margaret's assessment of Emma's proposals was characteristically practical, focusing on the realistic implementation requirements and potential complications rather than getting caught up in the excitement of possible solutions. The older woman's questions revealed both her protective instincts regarding Sophie's future and her hard-earned wisdom about the gap between theoretical possibilities and practical results. Sophie's presence during these adult conversations provided a constant reminder of what was at stake beyond mere financial calculations. The child's questions about whether they would have to move away from the ranch and leave her friends at school carried an emotional weight that made abstract discussions of debt management and cash flow projections intensely personal for everyone involved in the decision-making process. Tom's contribution to their planning sessions reflected his intimate knowledge of the ranch's operations and his understanding of which improvements would provide the greatest return on investment. His practical perspective helped ground Emma's research-based recommendations in the reality of daily ranch management, ensuring that proposed changes would actually work given their existing resources and constraints. The application process for multiple funding programs required a level of documentation and analysis that would have been impossible without Emma's organizational skills and academic training. Each program demanded different information presented in specific formats, creating a paperwork burden that could have consumed weeks of David's time while potentially missing critical deadlines. Emma's ability to manage the complex application requirements while maintaining her other responsibilities demonstrated the value she brought to the ranch beyond her research project. Her contributions to operational efficiency, financial analysis, and strategic planning had become integral to their daily functioning in ways that made the prospect of her eventual departure increasingly problematic for everyone involved. The first positive response to their funding applications arrived 3 weeks after the foreclosure notice, bringing news that their conservation program enrollment had been approved for payments that would cover nearly half of their immediate debt obligations. The relief that accompanied this partial solution was tempered by awareness that they still needed to secure additional funding to avoid losing the ranch entirely. Emma's reaction to their partial success revealed the depth of her emotional investment in the ranch's survival and her growing attachment to the Harper family. Her celebration was genuine but subdued, reflecting her understanding that half a solution was still insufficient to guarantee their future security and that additional challenges lay ahead in their struggle to preserve the operation. David's gratitude for Emma's assistance had evolved beyond professional appreciation into something more personal and complex. Though he remained careful not to express feelings that might complicate their working relationship or create expectations that circumstances might not allow them to fulfill. The awareness that her help had made their partial success possible was balanced by uncertainty about whether their collaboration would continue beyond the immediate crisis. The second wave of funding approvals that arrived the following week brought them close enough to their target amount that David began to believe they might actually succeed in saving the ranch. The combination of government assistance, tax benefits, and operational improvements that Emma had identified was generating the resources they needed while also creating a foundation for long-term sustainability. Margaret's reaction to their improving prospects was characteristically cautious, expressing appreciation for Emma's contributions while avoiding assumptions about future arrangements that might not materialize. The older woman had learned to be protective of Sophie's emotional well-being, making her reluctant to encourage the child's growing attachment to Emma without some assurance that their living situation would remain stable. Sophie's excitement about their success was uncomplicated by adult concerns about sustainability or long-term planning, reflecting a child's faith in the ability of the grown-ups in her life to solve whatever problems threatened their security. Her casual references to Emma as a permanent part of their family revealed the depth of attachment that had developed during their months of shared domestic life. Tom's assessment of their situation reflected both relief about the ranch's survival and concern about what would happen when Emma's research project concluded and she returned to her previous life. The foreman had observed the positive changes that her presence had brought to the household and understood that her departure would create gaps that would be difficult to fill through other means. Emma's own feelings about the prospect of leaving the ranch had become increasingly complicated as her attachment to the Harper family deepened and her investment in their success grew beyond professional interest. The financial security that living at the ranch provided had allowed her to focus on her studies without the constant stress of making ends meet, while the sense of purpose she found in helping save the operation gave meaning to her academic work that textbook exercises couldn't provide. The completion of Emma's thesis project should have marked the natural conclusion of her residence at the ranch, but the practical benefits of their arrangement for all parties involved made the prospect of change seem unnecessarily disruptive. Her contributions to ranch operations had become integral to their improved efficiency, while the stable housing situation had allowed her to make significant progress toward completing her degree without accumulating additional debt. David struggled to address the question of Emma's long-term role at the ranch was complicated by his awareness that any romantic overtures might be interpreted as exploitation of her vulnerable financial situation or inappropriate behavior toward someone who had been living in his household as a research guest. The genuine affection that had developed between them was obvious to outside observers but remained largely unacknowledged in their direct interactions. The catalyst that forced them to confront their evolving relationship came from an unexpected source when Dr. Wells visited the ranch to review Emma's research progress and evaluate the success of their collaboration. The professor's conversations with each member of the Harper family revealed the depth of mutual attachment that had developed and the impracticality of maintaining professional boundaries in a living situation that had become genuinely domestic. Dr. Wells' assessment of the situation reflected both her academic interest in successful research partnerships and her personal concern for Emma's welfare and future prospects. The professor could see that Emma's work at the ranch had evolved beyond thesis research into the kind of practical experience that would be invaluable for her career development. while also recognizing that the personal relationships involved created complications that required careful consideration. Emma's conversation with her mentor about the future revealed her own uncertainty about how to balance professional goals with personal attachments that had become more important to her than she had expected when she first agreed to conduct research at the ranch. The success of her thesis project had opened doors to graduate school opportunities and career prospects that would require her to leave the valley and pursue a more conventional academic path. David's discussion with Dr. Wells about Emma's contributions to the ranch's success led to the professor's suggestion that their arrangement could be formalized in ways that would benefit both parties while addressing the practical and ethical concerns that surrounded their current situation. The idea of offering Emma a permanent position as ranch manager and agricultural consultant would provide her with career experience while ensuring that the ranch could continue to benefit from her expertise. The proposal that emerged from these conversations represented a creative solution to the practical challenges that all parties faced, though it left unaddressed the personal feelings that had developed between David and Emma. The offer of permanent employment would provide Emma with financial security and professional experience while allowing the ranch to maintain the improvements that her presence had made possible. Emma's consideration of the employment offer was complicated by her awareness that accepting would mean choosing a different career path than she had originally planned, potentially limiting her future options in exchange for immediate security and meaningful work. The decision required her to evaluate whether the personal satisfaction she found in helping the Harper family outweighed the professional opportunities that might be available through more conventional career development. Margaret's perspective on the proposed arrangement reflected her recognition that Emma's presence had been beneficial for everyone in the household, particularly Sophie, who had thrived under the influence of an educated woman who could provide both academic support and emotional guidance. The older woman's endorsement carried weight that helped legitimize an arrangement that might otherwise have seemed inappropriate. Sophie's reaction to the possibility that Emma might stay permanently was enthusiastic and uncomplicated, reflecting a child's desire for stability and her genuine affection for someone who had become an important part of her daily life. The 8-year-old's happiness about the prospect provided a reminder that family relationships could develop in unexpected ways when people cared for each other's well-being. Tom's support for formalizing Emma's role at the ranch was based on his observation of her positive impact on operational efficiency and his understanding that her departure would leave gaps in management and planning that would be difficult to fill. The foreman's practical assessment reinforced the business case for maintaining their collaboration beyond its original research framework. The negotiations that surrounded Emma's employment offer revealed the complexity of transforming a research arrangement into a professional relationship while acknowledging the personal attachments that had developed among all parties. The terms they discussed included not just salary and benefits but also living arrangements and role definitions that would allow her to maintain both professional credibility and personal comfort. Emma's acceptance of the position was influenced by her recognition that the work she was doing at the ranch represented exactly the kind of career she had hoped to build through her academic studies, providing opportunities to apply sustainable agriculture principles in real-world situations while making a meaningful difference in the lives of people she had come to care about deeply. David's relief at securing Emma's continued presence at the ranch was tempered by his awareness that their professional relationship still left unresolved the personal feeling that had developed between them. The employment arrangement provided a framework for maintaining their collaboration while avoiding the ethical complications that might have surrounded romantic involvement with someone who had been his houseguest. The summer months that followed Emma's transition from research guest to ranch employee established new routines that reflected her expanded role in both operational management and household life. Her contributions to strategic planning and financial management were complemented by her continuing assistance with Sophie's education and her growing partnership with Margaret in managing domestic responsibilities. The success of the conservation and improvement projects that Emma had initiated began to show measurable results in both environmental and financial terms.
validating her academic training while demonstrating the practical value of applying research-based solutions to real-world challenges. The ranch's improved efficiency and reduced operating costs created a foundation for long-term sustainability that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Emma's reputation within the local ranching community grew as news of the Harper Ranch's transformation spread through the informal networks that connected agricultural families throughout the valley. Her expertise in accessing government programs and implementing sustainable practices attracted inquiries from other struggling operations seeking similar assistance, creating opportunity for consulting work that could supplement her ranch salary. David's leadership role in local agricultural organizations was enhanced by his operations success and Emma's expertise, allowing him to share their experiences with other ranchers while establishing himself as an advocate for innovative approaches to traditional challenges. Their partnership demonstrated that combining practical experience with academic training could produce results that neither could achieve independently. Sophie's academic performance and personal development under Emma's influence reflected the benefits of having a stable, educated woman in her life who could provide both intellectual stimulation and emotional support. The child's confidence in her own abilities grew as she received encouragement for both traditional ranch skills and academic achievement, preparing her for whatever future she might choose. Margaret's role in their household evolved to accommodate Emma's permanent presence while maintaining her own authority and importance in family decisions. The older woman's experience and Emma's education created a combination that benefited everyone in the household while providing Sophie with multiple sources of guidance and support. The personal relationship between David and Emma continued to deepen through their shared work and domestic life, though both remained careful to maintain professional boundaries that protected their working relationship from potential complications. Their growing affection was obvious to outside observers but remained largely unacknowledged in their direct interactions, creating a tension that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The crisis that finally forced them to confront their feelings arrived in the form of job offers that Emma received from agricultural consulting firms and government agencies that had learned of her success at the Harper Ranch. The opportunities represented significant career advancement and financial improvement over her current position, though they would require her to relocate to different states and leave behind the life she had built in Colorado. Emma's struggle with these career opportunities reflected the conflict between professional ambition and personal attachment that had become increasingly central to her decision-making process. The positions offered everything she had thought she wanted from her education and career development, but accepting them would mean leaving people and work that had become more important to her than she had expected. David's reaction to news of Emma's job offers was complicated by his recognition that supporting her career advancement might require sacrificing his own interests and the ranch's continued benefit from her expertise. His respect for her abilities and concern for her future made it difficult to advocate for arrangements that might limit her professional development for his personal or business benefit. The conversations that surrounded Emma's career decisions finally provided the context for acknowledging the personal feelings that had been developing between her and David. Though both remained cautious about expressing emotions that might complicate their professional relationship or create pressure around her job choices. Margaret's advice to both David and Emma reflected her observation of their relationship and her understanding of the importance of honest communication in making decisions that would affect everyone in their household. The older woman's perspective carried weight because of her obvious concern for all parties' well-being rather than advocacy for any particular outcome. Sophie's reaction to the possibility that Emma might leave was emotional and direct, providing a child's perspective on relationships that cut through adult complications to express simple truths about love, attachment, and the importance of family bonds that transcend legal or biological definitions. Tom's contribution to their discussions was characteristically practical, focusing on the business implications of Emma's potential departure while also acknowledging the personal attachments that had developed and their importance for the family's happiness and stability. The resolution that emerged from weeks of difficult conversations was David's proposal that Emma consider marriage as a solution that would address both practical and personal concerns while allowing her to build a career that combined her professional interests with her attachment to the ranch and family that had become central to her life. David's proposal was carefully framed to emphasize mutual benefit rather than romantic pressure, acknowledging Emma's financial needs and career goals while expressing his own desire for a partnership that would serve both personal and professional interests. The arrangement he suggested would provide her with security and opportunity while giving him access to her skills and companionship on a permanent basis. Emma's consideration of David's proposal required her to evaluate whether marriage could provide the foundation for a life that honored both her professional ambitions and her personal attachments, while also considering the welfare of Sophie and Margaret, who would be affected by her decision. The practical benefits of marriage were obvious to both parties, including financial security, professional partnership, and the formalization of family relationships that had already developed through their shared domestic life. The emotional dimensions of their relationship, while genuine, had developed gradually through respect and compatibility rather than dramatic romantic gestures. Margaret's blessing of their engagement reflected her recognition that Emma's presence had been beneficial for everyone in the household, and that formalizing their relationship would provide the stability that Sophie needed while allowing David to build the kind of partnership that could support both personal happiness and professional success. Sophie's excitement about gaining Emma as a stepmother was uncomplicated by adult concerns about the practical nature of their arrangement, reflecting a child's understanding that love and family could take many different forms while serving the same essential functions of providing security, support, and belonging. Tom's reaction to their engagement was characterized by genuine happiness for his friends, combined with relief that the ranch would continue to benefit from Emma's expertise, and that the family unit that had developed would remain intact despite the challenges they had faced. The wedding that took place 3 months later was a simple ceremony that reflected their shared values and practical approach to life while celebrating the genuine affection that had grown between them. The event brought together the ranching community that had watched their relationship develop and supported their efforts to save the ranch through innovative approaches to traditional challenges. Emma's transformation from struggling college student to ranch owner and agricultural consultant represented the kind of American dream story that resonated with people who understood the value of hard work, practical solutions, and the willingness to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core values and commitments. David's evolution from a man facing foreclosure to a successful rancher implementing cutting-edge sustainable practices demonstrated the importance of being open to new ideas and partnerships, while maintaining the determination and work ethic that had sustained his family's operation through 4 generations of challenges and changes. Their marriage proved successful in ways that exceeded both practical expectations and romantic hopes, creating a partnership that served as the foundation for both personal happiness and professional achievement, while providing Sophie with the stable, supportive family environment that every child deserves. The ranch that had been saved through their collaboration became a model for other struggling operations throughout the region, demonstrating that combining traditional ranching knowledge with modern agricultural science could create opportunities for small family farms to compete successfully with larger corporate operations. Emma's consulting work with other ranching families provided additional income while allowing her to apply her expertise to a broader range of challenges and opportunities, building a reputation that extended far beyond their local community while maintaining her commitment to the values and practices that had made their own operation successful. David's leadership in agricultural organizations reflected his transformation from someone struggling to save his own ranch to someone helping others navigate the complexities of modern farming while preserving the traditions and values that made ranching an important part of American culture and rural community life. Sophie's development under the influence of both David and Emma provided her with opportunities and support that prepared her for whatever future she might choose, while maintaining her connection to the land and community that had shaped her childhood and would always be part of her identity. Margaret's satisfaction with the arrangement was evident in her continued involvement in ranch operations and family life. Her pride in their success and her contentment with the knowledge that her granddaughter was growing up in a stable, loving environment that honored both tradition and progress. The story of their unconventional courtship and successful marriage became part of local folklore, inspiring other people facing difficult circumstances to consider creative solutions that might not fit conventional expectations but could provide real answers to practical problems, while creating opportunities for personal growth and meaningful relationships. Years later, as visitors toured their operation to learn about sustainable ranching practices, Emma and David would share their story as an example of how academic knowledge and practical experience could be combined to create solutions that benefited both individual families and entire communities, while demonstrating that love and partnership could develop in the most unexpected circumstances. Their success had proven that arrangements based on mutual need and respect could evolve into genuine affection and lasting commitment when both parties were willing to work toward common goals, while supporting each other's individual growth and happiness. The ranch that had nearly been lost to foreclosure had become a testament to the power of innovation, collaboration, and the willingness to embrace change while preserving the values that made family agriculture an important part of American life and rural community sustainability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.